Everybody, as Chris said, my name is David Deans, one of the +1 coaches for our groups. Thank you, Chris, for the opportunity to share. I was telling Chris a little while ago before everybody logged in that I hadn't really sat down and kind of put my story together. And when you do that, you begin to see how God's hand's been touching, your life in different ways, kind of leading me to this point. I don't know, some of you that have been sharing have seen that as well, but I appreciated the opportunity to do that. Well, I'm going to share my DMM story, but like I just said, part of my DMM story, there's a backstory, right? Because God's providence, he's touching our lives and laying that path out. So I'm a Methodist pastor. I happen to be a 4th generation Methodist pastor. And I remember my grandmother when I was growing up saying, "You're going to be the next pastor." And I was like, "No, I don't think so, Grandma. That it is not what I'm going to do with my life." But God had a different plan and called me to be in ministry in a dramatic way. There was kind of a dramatic call on my life. I'll share that maybe another time. But my first church, Methodist Church, was right in the outskirts of Baltimore City. And, here God had to call me pretty dramatically to change my mind, to convince me that I really should be a pastor. And so here I've coming off this high of this calling and, did the whole whatever requirements, seminary and all that I had to do. But I'm feeling like, okay, I've, experienced God in supernatural ways. This is going to be awesome. And I'm on the outskirts of Baltimore. There's all kinds of, ways to be in ministry there. And so I start, like maybe many of us pastors, so excited to do ministry, thinking that God's going to use me to change the world. But it takes a little bit more time than usually, than we realize. And so the first, year, 2 years into my ministry, before I know it, I'm finding myself spending more time in church meetings and preparing for the big gatherings of Sunday mornings. And this is not what I felt like God had called me to do. So I start praying, God, did I hear you right? Is this is being a pastor? This is ministry? And so I start praying and really I'm frustrated. I'm depressed. I'm just trying to figure out, what God wants me to do. Feeling like God has so much more, like there's this feast that God invited me to, and I'm just dealing with the crumbs. And I'm like, there is more. I know it. I just don't know how to do it. So I start praying. So lesson 1 in all of this is, I quickly realized within a couple of years that the legacy kind of established church has this like centripetal force that continues to draw us inward more and more to support the inward structures, the existing people. And the more you're in that loop, the older your church is, the longer your denomination, if you're a part of a denomination, has been around, the greater that centripetal force of just pulling you in to support the institution. And so that's where I felt like I was trapped. And that was my first lesson. I had to pray to get out of that. So along comes, I was in ministry a few years, and along comes the Great Recession. So 2007, on the outskirts of Baltimore City in Maryland is where I am. And I start seeing the homeless population just start rising. Like, there's always been some people on the street corners, but now there was 2, and then 3, and then 10, and then, multiple street corners. And then there were places where they would hang out, where there were some feedings in the town, and those were now packed. And so something was happening, and we were experiencing it in a very real way there. And so a few of us in the church who were kind of thinking about that, a few of us had noticed that, a few of us that were more outreach focused started seeing that, and we started praying together like, okay, God, what do you want us to do about that? And remember, I'd been praying for an opportunity, like, God, get me out of the 4 walls of the church. This can't be it. So we're praying and realizing, what can we do about all of this? The Great Recession. We're a small church. What can we do about all these homeless? And so, we're thinking like, okay, what can we do? And we're discouraged. But then one of our prayer times, somebody comes and just says, what if we just start simple? What if we got a brown lunch bag made some peanut butter and jellies, and a bottle of water and some fruit, and just went out and see who was hungry and wanted a brown bag lunch. And so that started a wonderful ministry. We did that. That continued to grow. It started very simply, and we became known as the Bags of Hope people. So that name kind of caught, and we grabbed some other community partners and other churches. We started a rotating winter shelter, and eventually, after I left, but eventually all of that became its own 501c3 and still in existence today. And I think that's awesome. I was privileged to be a part of that that ministry. But that got me excited about, okay, I'm out of the four walls of the church, and God showed up. God showed up on the streets. We were praying with homeless. We were, I could talk for hours about just this, but I've got to move on. But it was an awesome opportunity just to get outside and meet people that weren't already church people, and they were people that weren't likely to come to the church. And we met all kinds of people, not just homeless. I mean, being out on the street, we met business owners, we met, other citizens walking up and down the road, all kinds of neighbors. And so had a blast doing that. So the second lesson for me was this, that it is really hard to escape that centripetal force, that pull of the legacy church, but prayer and a willingness to be obedient as you hear from God, you can fight against that pull and get more outward focus. So don't, if you're caught in that pool, be praying and be willing to obey. You can escape that force of drawing you inward more and more. And I learned in doing that the value of access ministry, right? I didn't call it that then. I didn't know that name, but what I did learn very quickly was serving people's, meeting people's needs. It opened up all kinds of possibilities to talk to them, to pray with them, to get to know their stories. Oh my gosh, the homeless people are the most interesting people you will ever meet. Let me tell you that. There were veterans, there were people who had been business owners, there were moms, there were dads. I mean, and you have all the other, there's addiction, there's mental health issues. It's some of the most interesting people. And during this Great Recession, it was people that, weren't the typical homeless, addict. They were people who just had a health issue and something happened, they lost everything. So just being out there, this access ministry opened up doors that I had never realized, that access that I didn't have before until I started serving people like that. So that was like key for me as well. Well, all fired up about the homeless ministry and being outside the four walls of the church. It didn't take long before I was just antsy, like, back in the church, I'm dealing with, the worship wars of contemporary versus traditional. I'm arguing about the color of the carpet. I mean, I'm like, the heck with that stuff. I need to get out there and be on the street with people and be in ministry. So from there, I started thinking about being a church planter. And so I started learning everything I could about church planting. Eventually, some of you all know the Exponential Conference down in Orlando. I started going to that, early on, one of the first couple of years that it had started. I got connected with some of the Exponential staff. I eventually kind of got coached and trained by some of the Exponential staff. And I was like, okay, I'm going to be a church planter. Well, being a Methodist, we have this bishop and we're appointed. So I couldn't just go do it unless I wanted to leave, the Methodist Church and all of that, which was a possibility. Might be more of a possibility now. I don't know. But so I had to go at that point. I had to go and talk to my bishop and kind of say, hey, here's what's on my heart. And part of the training and all I'd done in discernment had been some of the stuff that they had offered, but a lot of it was with Exponential and some other outside coaches. So I went and I explained, hey, this is my heart. I want the opportunity to do that. Will you sanction this? Appoint me to do that. They hadn't had a lot of success with church plants and parachute drops. And so they were really reticent to let me do that. And I'm going, come on, just give me a shot at it. And right before I was ready to give up, they finally came back and they said, you know what? we've been thinking about multi-site, and about that time, multi-site was the big buzzword. Everybody was talking multi-site. And so they're like, we would like you to maybe team up with one of our healthier churches and try to launch multi-site, launch some campuses, do multi-site. Let's see if that can work. So we're like, okay, I'll whatever you think, if that's what it takes to get me to be able to get back on the street. So that's how I got connected with Kevin Baker and with Oakdale. And that's a whole nother long story about all of that. They weren't quite ready. That wasn't quite their dream at the time, but we made it work. And eventually we did actually plant 2 campuses. We launched 2 campuses out of Oakdale. They ultimately didn't last. Maryland is a really tough place to do ministry and to church plant. It's very liberal, very diverse, it's very multicultural, which makes it that much more difficult. And it's very secular as well. And Exponential was helpful in teaching us how to draw the big crowds. We could draw the big crowds, but we could never quite figure out how to turn the crowds into disciples who multiply. That was the struggle. And as I began to realize that, I really went into another crisis mode, like a crisis of faith. I was realizing here I'm a 4th generation pastor. I went to seminary. I've been trained as a planter, and yet I still don't quite know the key for disciple making, especially multiplying disciples. And it was crushing. And I almost gave up right then and there. Like I said, I had a crisis and almost said I'm not meant to do this and walked away. But thankfully Oakdale and Kevin, that caused us to think, okay, we've learned some things. It hasn't been a failure. We've touched people's lives. Some of those people came back to the main campus. Others went on to other churches that we had reached. We had learned a lot, and it gave us a focus of we need to figure out what it's going to take in this postmodern secular area to reach people for Jesus. And so we had already kind of been disciple minded, but this gave us a passion for wanting to really look into it even deeper and to take what we learned and figure things out. So we started digging, and we looked through some more exponential stuff. We found discipleship.org. Some of you know about those folks. We found Real Life Discipleship with Jim Putnam, and we love that. Master Plan of Evangelism, Robert Coleman, a classic. And then finally, Kevin mentioned this a little bit last week, we found 40X, which is 4 Disciplines of Execution. Now that's a secular book, not really about making disciples, but it really talked about leveraging lead versus lag measures and wildly important goals. And it helped us to kind of better organize ourselves and go after those lead measures. So that was helping us. And it was in this, thinking about wildly important goals, WIGs, that then we found wigtake.com. Our communications director was doing some research, and she stumbled upon Chris Galanos's blog and then his book. So we read his book, Multisite to Multiplication, or Megachurch to Multiplication. And we're like, this is it. This is what we've been looking for. And the book started making sense. And it was exactly some of the things that we had been talking about wanting to find. And so we got psyched up about that, and we learned about the DMM training that Chris and Eli offered. We signed up for a training in January of 2020. We had about 20 staff and some leaders in the church that were all in a big room, sitting around a big TV, on Zoom, and we did the training, and all of it was like, yes, this makes sense. Based on what we've been experiencing, of all the stuff we've been learning, this stuff was making sense based on, our context and everything we'd been through. This seemed like it could work. It was working around the world, and we felt like it had a chance of working even in Maryland. And it was awesome, but it was also like wrecked us, right? It was like, you can't go back to doing church the way we've been doing it. And it was like, can we convince the rest of the congregation, the rest of the leaders to kind of, be on board with us? Luckily, we'd been there for years, and things started to click. Well, right about then, the pandemic hit, and it was like, At first, what we thought was going to be a setback actually was a blessing. Like all the conventional modes of ministry that people were doing just stopped, right? It wasn't possible anymore. But things like prayer walks, things like discovery Bible studies and corporate prayer and DMM trainings on Zoom, all of that was like right on the money, right what was needed at that time. So that gave us, we were like, okay, God put this in our lap just for this. And we started leveraging that for every way we could. And people were open to it. People were hungry for connection. This made sense to people. People were looking for hope. They were looking for God in the midst of this. They were scared. So whether it was in our congregation or whether it was in the community, this seemed to touch people's minds and hearts and was drawing them in. And we saw the practical applications of these things, and we started seeing some fruit. I took a couple different men's groups through the training. I took a Celebrate Recovery group, through some of those stories. The scripture sets are great. Like there's a recovery scripture set. I grabbed hold of that and took some, because Celebrate Recovery, if some of you did Celebrate Recovery, at first, like Celebrate Recovery was even shut down before they did the Celebrate Recovery online or whatever the tweaked version. So CR stopped meeting. So I'm like, hey, we don't have to stop meeting. Hey, let me grab some of you guys. We'll do these recovery scriptures. And some of these guys were like, I've never been in a Bible study before, but because they were already connected in with recovery and with me, they were willing to give it a try. And I think some of that stuff was even more powerful. As much as I love CR, like some of that was even more powerful than just the regular CR stuff, as we just got deep in God's word. And I taught them, the discovery Bible study method and, the obedience steps. And these guys were taking obedient steps in their lives to get over their addictions or to make up with family. And they're like, some of them had never even read the Bible before like that. I mean, they'd read some of the verses through CR, but not just opening the scriptures and reading them. And so that was awesome. And I had time now to really, my kids were home. My kids were teenagers then. They're still, my youngest is still 19. My daughter's 21 now, but a couple years ago, they were a little bit younger, but they were teenagers. They don't want to do anything with mom and dad, but the pandemic, they were kind of forced, they couldn't go out, especially early on. We were like, oh my gosh, you can't talk to anybody. You can't go see anybody. So they were at home and going crazy. We're like, hey, let's do DBS with the family. And so in the evenings after dinner or before dinner, we just, as a family, and the kids at first, they were like, I don't know, I don't want to do this with you guys. You all are old. What do you know? But they had nothing else to do, and we kind of made them. And so they stuck it out, and they actually loved it. And so much so that I couldn't believe they let me do this. Like at this point, we were like recording our sermons and sending them in for, the production team to put them all together. And so I said, this is what I'm going to do. And I asked my family about that, and they actually went with it. The idea was like, we're going to do a DBS together. We're going to do an abbreviated DBS. We're going to film that, and that's going to be the sermon. What do you think? And they were like, at first they were like, I don't know, Dad. And my wife's like, I don't know. But I'm like, I trusted God. I'm like, okay, what is God telling you? Pray about it and let's see. And they came back and they were willing to do it. And so we had so much fun doing that, and the church loved it. Like people years later are still talking about that was a way of seeing this DMM, seeing this discovery group stuff in action. And with teenagers, they couldn't believe that teenagers, and my kids were genuinely into it. And I think that came through. And so parents were texting me and telling me for, weeks and days and years of, oh my gosh, that just impacted us, impacted our family so much. Thank you for doing that. And I think it gave another, edge to Oakdale with being able to okay, we've made another step. This is real. More people were willing to give DBS a try and to move forward. And then out of that, from doing DBS with my son and my family, my son had started, he was a part of he worked at this outdoor, one of those farm breweries. And so during the pandemic, everybody was there because there was nothing else to do and they were outdoors. So he was working like crazy, making good money. And he'd been doing DBS with us. And so he's like, Dad, one of the guys there at the brewery, actually one of the owners, was like, hey, let's start a Bible study over here. And so Evan kind of brought in the DBS stuff, brought in some of his buddies, and they started a Bible study, a DBS at this brewery, this farm microbrewery. And out of that, like, one of my son's best friends was baptized. We took him down to the river. I didn't baptize him. Like, one of the guys that was leading the group baptized him. And all the guys, there was like 20 young men as a part of this. And my son was a part of that. It was so touching to me. It was like just one of my proudest moments of just seeing my son be a part of that, his best friend. So it brought it home to be so real with my son. And so all of us are just getting excited about this, and, things are taking off. And right about that time, remember, I'm Methodist, we've got this bishop. So right about that time, I get a call. We want to move you. I'm like, move me? What? Like, that was the last thing on my mind. Like, my son was a senior in high school. We were gonna stay where we were. Things were finally, I've been at Oakdale for 10 years. We've been searching and praying for something, discipleship and something to connect. Finally, this stuff was connecting. All the work that I'd done, I wanted to be a part of the exciting stuff, and now I was getting moved. And so I'm like, I don't know. And I talked to Kevin about it, and I prayed about it. My family and I prayed about it. And we thought, God's trying to expand the kingdom. God wants to take disciple making. This is in another county. So I was being moved to a church about 20 minutes north. And the pastor, this was during the pandemic, right, too. And so the pastor who was, and that's the church I'm at now, the pastor had to suddenly kind of leave and go back to Michigan. Her elderly parents were sick, and one of them unfortunately ended up passing away, but she had to leave to go care for them, and she just stayed in Michigan. And so the church really needed a pastor. And so because of the need, and because praying for it, I felt like God saying, yep, that's where I want you to go. We made the announcement to Oakdale, and our family and I, made the adjustment to the new church here, Glenelg. And but I'm feeling like, okay, freshly trained DMM, I'm feeling God's calling me there to a new county. This must be like God's ready to like do something big. And oh my gosh, I'm gonna go. I'm gung ho now about DMM. So I go into this new church feeling like this is what God's called me to do. And if that was God's plan, I'm not sure that he had told the church leaders at the new church that they're bringing a new pastor that's on fire for disciple making movements, because I came in and they're like, whoa, who is this guy? And it was tough. The leaders weren't ready for that. I probably came in a little too gung ho, a little too on fire, a little too pushing, disciple making, and too hard, too fast. And I jumped right in. I said, hey, Chris's book was one of the things that really helped us. So I'm like, I took my board. I'm like, we're going to read Chris's book. And so we read Chris's book, and we took like 6 weeks to unpack it and have discussions. And I took a few of the leaders through a DBS to give them a sense of that. We started some prayer times. I'm just trying anything, hoping that something will stick, right? Well, the only thing that stuck was that they had this new pastor who they barely knew, who was trying to get them to do some really scary, radical stuff. Reading Chris's part about, some of the Pipsy areas. So they took that one thing, like, oh my gosh, he wants us to go to like the rough parts of the neighborhood, and he's going to like kick us out of his car and leave us there and run away. And we're supposed, so they're like taking all of this stuff, and they're just scared. And that's what stuck. Right. And so DMM became like a bad word for, and a label that they were able to use to kind of dismiss, disciple making movements. Like, if you label it, it's not really biblical. It's just DMM. And then they can kind of say it's a cultish and definitely not United Methodist, right? This is definitely not United Methodist. But that was the thing I tried to help them see, like, oh my gosh, of all the disciple making strategies I've seen, this is one of the closest to what Methodists at their roots, right? The Wesleys, you know, the DNA of the methodical Wesleyans, you know, intentionally making disciples. This was one of the closest things. And I tried, and I'm still trying as best as I can to get that across to all of these Methodists today, that this is closer to our roots more than you realize. You know what John Wesley and others were doing, those early Methodists, those circuit riders, those men and women, boys and girls who were on the frontier edge of things and making disciples. This is what they were doing. It is radical and scary stuff, but that's what created a movement. The Methodist movement was the first movement in the United States, right? The first spiritual movement was the Methodist movement. And so I'm trying to bring that back home to them, but it's a struggle. And so lesson number 4 was I can't force DMM. I'll never be able to convince people that it's from God and a strategy that we should adopt. You know, God has to do this. God has to get people there. Just like when you're looking for the spiritually hungry people, God has to have done the work in them. It's the same with catching a vision for DMM for other Christians. Like, God has to do that in them. Roy Moran, I remember he was on the call one time here, and he said something like, I'm sure I don't have it exactly right, but he said something like, you know, don't try to sell disciple making or DMM, you know, from up front. Like, grassroots movements always start from the back. You know, look for people on the fringe, look for the radicals, look for the people who are unsatisfied with the status quo and enlist them. So that's what I've tried to do. So my strategy has changed a little bit, and I've just trying to look for, you know, who's open, who's on the fringe, who's ready. I started incorporating more and more prayer. You know, legacy churches have 1 million church meetings. So, hey, and who can say we're not going to pray, right? So I'm like, hey, we're gonna pray, and not just for 30 seconds. We're gonna pray for 10 minutes and then 15 minutes, and now some of them are 20 minutes. So I'm leveraging some of these existing church meetings to pray. I can't beat that. I'm taking people who are ready to, like, I'm taking just individuals on prayer walks, people who I think might be willing or interested, and have had some luck with that. I'm trying to find ways to introduce DMM strategies into existing outreach ministries. So, you know, the church, social outreach is huge with our church. They do a lot of great things, a lot of great ministries. So how can I, you know, gently begin to influence some of the leaders in some of those ministries, or go to some of those ministries and some of those outreach events and slowly incorporate some of the DMM principles, but do kind of a soft, you know, launch of that, nothing hard and fast like I had been doing. I'm teaching disciple Bible study to, you know, when families or individuals come to me for baptism, hey, we're going to do the baptism story sets together. And I've started, actually, like, we baptize infants. So some of the families come to me, I do the first one for them. And then I say, you know, most of them have like godparents or a sponsor or parents or something. I'm like, you go find somebody in your family, your godparents, your sponsors, and you do the rest of these scriptures. And then we're going to talk. And so I've been, you know, doing that. When folks come to me for weddings, we introduce DBS as part of the counseling experience before, you know, the wedding prep, the counseling prep. Membership class, you know, we still have like membership. And so, hey, I'm gonna leverage that, and I'm gonna have them do DBS as part of that. I'm planning that this fall, to take people through Discovery Bible Studies as part of that membership class. And I've learned, for God's sake, don't call it disciple making movements, especially don't call it DMM. And you can just go in there and start doing that kind of stuff without giving it the name or the label, and that's going over much better. Well, I kind of started with Baltimore, and so it's interesting. Baltimore's come back into my story with the church here. Not too long ago, I saw a news article and then a news video on the TV of a pastor, happened to be another Methodist pastor, which was in Baltimore City in the Sandtown neighborhood. So Sandtown, think Freddie Gray, if you remember that a few years back. So this pastor is in one of the roughest parts of Baltimore City. And he's got a vision for cleaning it up, for helping the city to kind of come back and renew the city and clean things up and make disciples. And so he's on the news, and they've been trying to like buy properties and then use them for God's glory and for disciple making. And part of the process of trying to buy a lot across the street from them, it was owned by a big company, Northeastern Plumbing and Supply Company. Come to find out, like in the midst of the negotiations, the family who owned that big company and the property came back and they said, you know what, we believe in what you're doing. We've seen you at work here. He had been there now for years, so he wasn't new to the area. They're like, we believe in what you're doing. We're going to give you that lot. And we're not just going to give you that lot. We're going to give you the 2 huge warehouses on either side of that lot as well, because we believe in what you're doing. And so I saw that and it was like, that's God. Like God is at work there. So I took some people. Remember, my church was like, the last thing they wanted was like, don't put us into the roughest part of the neighborhood. But I cast this vision to some of my folks and I said, hey, let's just do a recon. Let's just go up and see what is happening. You know, I'm not saying we're going to do anything. Let's just go see what God's doing there. And because they are interested in outreach, I had a few of them say, okay, they'd like to do that. And one of the pastors, one of the other things I'm doing in the area is I'm connecting with all the pastors around me and trying to see if they've got a vision for disciple making. And one of the pastors at the Baptist church not far from my church was interested. And so he's been trained in DMM. I took him through a couple weeks ago, and he's actually going to be joining this call, I think, starting next week. But anyhow, he was interested in coming with me. So I had a few of us. We went up to Baltimore City, and this pastor and this ministry, it was legit. Like you could see all of Baltimore City and just the trash and the drugs and the needles, but like the 2 blocks right around this church were clean. Like, and he said, this wasn't because we're always coming out here cleaning as the church people. Like he said, we've earned respect. Like he said, you know, the drug addicts don't come on our block. They've got respect for us and they know I'll chase them off anyways. And he said, and sometimes we do have to come out and clean up. But he said, we're going to continue to clean up block by block, further and further out. And this is like, as we went, this guy was like, we'd see groups of young guys and we'd see homeless and we'd see people in the street corners or alleyways. And like, wherever we went, it was like, hey, Pastor Rodney, what's up, Pastor? Like, people knew him. He was a pastor in the streets. The people knew him all. In fact, he had gotten a row home just across the street from his church, and he lives there purposely. Now he's by himself. He's divorced, and also he says, I felt like I could live there. I wanted to live there. He said, my bride now is the church and the ministry that God's called me to do. So anyhow, that's got some potential. He's making some disciples of addicts and prostitutes, and I've cast some DMM vision to him. And some of my church now, some of my leaders are asking other people in the congregation, hey, maybe we could go up there. What do you all think? So if you all will join me in praying for that. I don't know what God has in store for that, but talk about a Poughkeepsie area and a place where disciples need to be made who multiply. It's Baltimore City. If I don't know, national news, if you've heard, I mean, Baltimore City is getting worse and worse. The crime rate, the violence, the murders are just going, the rats are just going out of the roof in Baltimore City. Well, I'd be amiss if I also didn't talk about what's happening in Kenya. So to back up a little bit. So I just left Oakdale, was a part of Glenelg and being a pastor here. And Kevin kind of mentioned this just briefly a little bit last week. And all of a sudden, Oakdale got this email from this person in Kenya who said, you know, it was still during the pandemic. And this guy basically said, you know, hey, right before the pandemic, a missionary had come into our town, into our village, and it started to talk about Jesus. And some of us started to kind of listen. And we had this little group, and we started to be intrigued. And then the pandemic came and the missionary left. And he's like, and I want to continue, but I don't know what to do. And he said, the weirdest thing, he said, my wife is part of trying to help make money during the pandemic because they lost a lot of their work, just like everybody did around the world. But they were really impacted in this kind of poor little village out in the western part of Kenya. He said, so my wife, just trying to make ends meet to help our family, started doing third-hand clothes. And so Americans like throw away so many clothes. And so they get a whole bunch of these clothes from the States. And then she turns around and she sells them. And, you know, the people in Kenya, the little kids and others, they love to get American clothes and Levi jeans and t-shirts and all of that. And they go crazy over that apparently. And he said, but one of the shirts was a Vacation Bible School shirt. And it was from this church called Oakdale. And I thought, let me look up this Oakdale. Now they're really poor, but they all have these smartphones, right? And so he had some internet, so he was able to look on his smartphone. He looked up Oakdale, and Oakdale had all of our website had been redesigned to put, you know, disciple making stuff all on there. And he looked at that and he said, and I knew this is the church that's going to teach us how to do disciple making. And so that was like such an incredible story. We're like, is this true? Like Kevin's joke is like, yeah, we thought it was like the Prince of Nairobi, you know, calling, and if you'll just donate, you know, but he never asked for money, and he seemed to be legit, and he emailed a couple times. So finally, you know, they'd kind of mentioned this to me. Finally, they talked to me again. Somebody from Oakdale, one of the staff, calls me, and they said, we really think this is serious, or genuine, but they're like, you know, what do we know about Africa? All of us, you know, we're here in Maryland. Most of us are white, and you know, David, you know, you've done a lot of ministry in diverse cultures, but I don't know if you're even the right one. And they're like, what about your friend Kende? So back to the church plant. So I had met this Kenyan couple that had been in the States for a couple of years. They'd come for school and then stayed and got married. And I had met them and discipled them, and they were part, and I'd stayed close to them. They're like, what about your friend Kende? Oh, and I had taken Kende through the DMM training. They're like, Kende's been trained. He loves Jesus. Now he's from Nigeria. He's not from Kenya, but hey, that's a lot closer than Maryland, right? Maybe the cultures, maybe there's something there. Do you think Kende would do that? And I'm like, you know, that is an awesome idea. So I called Kende, I explained to him what was happening. And meanwhile, he'd been having kind of a crisis of like, okay, here he'd been trained in DMM, and, you know, he was struggling. And actually he had struggles like as a Black man, just going around in his community, like prayer walking, like people looked like weird at him, like he was going to do something. Here he is just trying to prayer walk and talk to people. And so he had those kind of struggles, and you know, he just didn't know what God wanted him to do with this. And so this intrigued him. Now he was nervous and he hadn't done anything like this before, but I said, hey, Kende, look, I'll walk with you. I'll be with you. We'll do this together, you know, but you be the front guy, because I think that Samuel is the guy's name from Kenya. Samuel will connect better with you. And then, you know, you and I will talk and we'll work through any challenges and we'll do this together. He's like, he prayed about it and he came back. He's like, let's do it. So he reached out, and the first couple calls were just to make sure this was legit. So he kept coming back. Hey, I think this is legit. This guy is interested. He seems to be passionate about wanting to know stuff. You know, I've told him a few things. He's obeying already. So we're like, okay, let's go all in with this. So we get out the creation to Christ, and we look at that, and we do a few tweaks to that to make it fit the Kenyan context, and we launch that, and Kende meets with Samuel. Now this is, you know, Cane Day's still in Maryland as well. So this is like all the way across the different continents, right? So Cane Day's in Maryland, Samuel's in Kenya. So they're doing like WhatsApp texting and WhatsApp voice, and sometimes the internet's not great. And so this is nothing ideal. And we're thinking, is this going to work? I don't know. So Cane Day starts meeting once a week with Samuel, and he does the DBS. He starts taking him through creation to Christ. And then he says to Samuel, okay, the point is you've got to now do this with some friends or your family. And so Samuel starts doing that. He starts doing that. He gets a little group of his friends together, some of them from that had known the missionary. I think his wife was a little unsure at first. And so I don't know that she was a part of it right away, but he gets these other men and they start doing DBS, and they latch on. They're obeying. They're coming back with great questions, great I will statements. Next thing you know, like Samuel's ready to give his life to Jesus. And we're having to slow him down because I'm talking to Chris about this, like, oh, Samuel already wants to be baptized. Should we baptize him? And Chris is like, well, is the other people in the group want to be baptized? How about his wife and his family? We're like, not yet. And he's like, well, if Samuel's ready to like kind of, wait a little bit, if he's willing to wait a little bit, maybe we could bring along his family and some of the other guys. And so we talked to Samuel. He was willing to do that. Long story short, I could talk on this for an hour. Long story short, Samuel is baptized, becomes Christian. His wife is baptized, becomes, a follower of Jesus. Several of his original group is baptized, becomes followers of Jesus. And now it's been just over a year. And Samuel got a vision. He's had a vision of reaching all of Kenya for Christ. And it's been just over a year. And they now have 10 to 15 discovery groups containing 80 to 100 people in 5 different regions in Kenya. It's incredible what's happening. Like, there's been miracles. They're reaching Muslims. Now it's getting dangerous now too, because they've been to some Muslim communities and there's been some threats. And so we've had to deal with this, and we've gotten Stan Parks involved now because it's way over my head. And so Stan has been helpful. And this stuff is just going like crazy. And here's the thing that I have least control over is what is growing the most. Now, I'm a control freak, and I've been trying to get these ministries going and to get this disciple making happening. The thing that I have the least control over, the thing that I didn't start up, it's just kind of a God thing, that's what's taking off the most. Now, we're having some, there's some wins and some of the other stuff, but the thing that is going like crazy, like gangbusters, is the thing that God did and that I have the least control over. In fact, it's probably one of the things, I take it seriously, but it's probably one of the things, I don't have to spend a whole lot of time in it. I meet with Cane Day, we talk, we chat, I meet with Stan sometimes, but it's not like, it's taking hours and hours and hours of my time a week. This is what's growing. That's lesson 5 for me. I remember back in my day when I did Experiencing God, some of you maybe did the Henry Blackaby Experiencing God, and he said, look where God is working and join God there. That keep raising that, we might say, keep raising the sails and wait for the Spirit to blow. And that's what's happened there. And oh my gosh, it's one of the most exciting things that's happened in my ministry. And I'll end with this, the last lesson. And some of us have said this, it's a spiritual battle. I feel like I'm constant, I'm not Chris Colanos. Who am I to even be talking to you all? You all have done amazing things, probably bigger churches and reach more people, and so I'm constantly struggling with, I'm a failed church planter. Who am I to do this and to be a part of your group, your all's group, this group, our group together, to be a part of what's happening in Kenya. And it's a constant struggle, a wrestle with my own insecurities, a wrestle with time restraints. And I'm still a legacy pastor. And so I've got that, remember that centripetal force that keeps pulling me back in. And there are times I'm not, doing the disciple making I want to do. There are seasons where I'm better at it than others. I struggle with my own obedience. I struggle with my own church. And so this is I don't feel like this is all going easy, or that I'm on smooth sailing. This is a constant fight, a constant battle, a constant, attack. But I feel like God's saying to me, David, I've got a plan. Like all the story that I told you, the backstory, that was God, like all the way. Now that maybe I took some, I'm not saying I did everything perfectly, but God kept me on his path one way or the other. And like, I could see now God's hand all the way through all of that. And God's saying to me, just keep abiding in me, keep abiding in Jesus, right? Keep focusing on my word, keep praying, don't give up, persevere. And the scripture, God, as I was doing this, the scripture that came to mind, and I'll end with this, Chris, is James 1:2-4. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Well, thank you all for letting me share. It's just a privilege to be with you and to even have this opportunity to share my story with you all. Thanks.